I am so excited after all of that, in part because I was so delighted. It's like, for those of you watching, I saw so many wonderful connections to the stuff we're about to cover, and it got me so excited. So Gwen, you're going to share your screen. And while you do, I'm just going to yammer because it's easy. I'm Elizabeth. I work at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and Renwick Gallery. And as you know, because you signed up for this session, we are going to be exploring Alma Thomas today. Perhaps a familiar image has already appeared on your screen. Our session is titled Teacher, Artist, Trailblazer, Inspiration. So we're going to explore the many facets of this woman artist. And this is a sneak peek session. So we are particularly looking forward to our exhibition in October 2023, which is called Composing Colors, Paintings by Alma Thomas. So what are we going to do? Because we're going to move quickly. We've got 50 minutes together to cover a lot of ground. So if you'll page ahead one, Gwen, you'll see that we are going to move through 3 steps. The bulk of our time will be spent between steps 1 and 2. We'll begin with an observe, interpret, and wonder approach, which you may know as See, Think, Wonder. And if you don't know the Harvard Project Zero thinking routines, observe, interpret, wonder works as well. And our intention is to model for you a teaching strategy that is interactive, and it also ends in a place of curiosity so that we can then hear from Gwen. And Gwen, who are you? I asked you to just page ahead one. I forgot to ask you, who are you?
They tell me that I'm a conservator of paintings. What they don't know is that I have probably the coolest job I could ever imagined. And I think about, if I could tell my 12-year-old self what I would be doing now, I wouldn't have been able to comprehend it. That it has been an absolute treat to start as somebody who was very interested in artwork, but have an aptitude for science, and then come across this perfect blend of the two. So I am a paintings conservator, and I am entrusted with the care of the Smithsonian American Museum's paintings collection. And in addition to caring for the object, I get to help scholars and curators actually research these objects and work with education to share with the public things we learn from the artwork in our research.
So you're going to help us in step 2 when we're doing those STEAM connections. And then in step 3, which will be like blinding fast, it'll just be a chance for us to share with you participants today, or those watching the recording, a little bit of information about where you might find more. So to get us started, we're going to jump into step 1, and we're going to do an observing activity with an archival photograph. So rather than showing you an Alma Thomas work, because you're going to see bunches of them in Gwen's section, the intention of this portion is for us to kind of sharpen our looking skills and start to think about ways that we might layer in our prior knowledge, or kind of hone the critical thinking moves that we're going to need later as we start to digest the beautiful, rich information that Gwen provides us. So Gwen is, in one moment, when I say go, going to put up on the screen a single segment of the aforementioned archival photograph. And my invitation to you participating today is that you, in the chat box, write down 5 things that you can see for each of those segments. And Cody, who's lurking in the background, is going to share out loud some of the things that you put into the chat box. So when I say observe or see, I mean things that you can actually point to. So ready, set, go. 5 things that you can see. So Gwen, even though I've already seen this photograph a bunch of times, I'm seeing for the first time the notch in her collar. So I see this V shape that makes me think there's a notch. What's something that you see?
Pointing to the dress alone, and something that we see in Alma Thomas's artwork are the patterns of the fabric.
Oh yeah, I'd say there are a lot of patterns, right? There's a small checkerboard, there's a medium checkerboard, and then there's a large checkerboard. There's a lot, there are 3 different patterns right there. I love that. Cody is sending us a message. Yes, put it in the chat box on this event side so Cody can tell us things out loud. Thank you. What more do I see? I see that
this is coming in from Tracy Slattery. I see a checkered pattern. And Jessica Andrews says, I see a woman looking down and an updo. Tracy says a vase. Abby Smith says the pattern. Oh my gosh, everyone's really jumping in now. Abby Smith
Love.
says the pattern on her clothes. Darren Milligan says background painting, killer bangs.
Killer bangs indeed.
Checkered top painting in the background. She has bangs, hair in a bun, downward gaze, 2 paintings behind her. So yeah, really focusing on a lot of the physical observations.
Love. Okay, so let's keep going. We're going to do the same thing again, but we're going to see more of the photograph. Bear in mind that you can do the same approach with really anything. So if you are a literature teacher, for instance, you might want to segment a bit of a newspaper in this way. Alternatively, if you're a science teacher and you've got some sort of diagram and you need to slow down your students looking and thinking, you can parse things out. So again, now that we can see more of the photograph, what are 5 more things that you see? So now I'm a plant person, so I'm immediately seeing this, I don't know what it's called, but the plant on the right side of the screen, kind of peeking into the frame. What's something that you see now, Gwen?
Oh, the painting. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. What
Of
do
course,
you
I'm trying
see?
to look for them.
Yeah. What do you notice particularly about this painting? What's grabbing your eye that you could point to?
The frames, and frames on both of them, which to me suggests that they are near or they are completed. But that's not true for everything.
Okay. So because you're an expert, you know that the frame would be on only after a certain point of like polish, let's say, on the
at this point in time, and understanding how Alma Thomas painted. But thinking too, if you look at medieval pieces, things that were done on panel, they might have an engaged frame where the frame was actually built into the support. And then that would also be painted or gilded as part of the process.
Gwen, you're a wonder. I am so grateful. Are there any chat box?
Yeah. So I think, our year of being on Zoom is really influencing some of these suggestions, but everyone's really noticing the potted plant, the windows.
Yes.
Really, what we all have been focusing on for the last year and seeing over and over and over. But some other observations about her being in the chair and more in relationship to her in the room and the walls and the windows. So
gorgeous. Thank you. Okay, let's see. I think this is our last view. Okay. Now we can see the whole image. And for teachers out in the world, I'll just offer that sometimes it's helpful for students to be told when they're seeing the whole image and when they're not. Because of course, when we're looking at a PowerPoint, it's hard to know where the edge of things is, or whether you've cropped it or something like that. So that's why I'm saying that out loud. I am amazed at how large this paintbrush is. I'm seeing a really large paintbrush in what I assume is her right hand. And then also I see maybe a gathering of paintbrushes on the right side. How about you, Gwen? What are you noticing now?
There is indeed that coffee can, all of the paints in front of her. But then something that we touch on as well later is she's painting flat and not on an easel.
Okay, beautiful.
I don't want to give too much away.
Okay, I like it.
The chat is definitely noticing the paintbrushes, the brushes, the tools for making artwork. And super fascinating about the easel. I didn't notice that myself.
I'm so glad too, Elizabeth, that you mentioned that the size of that paintbrush. I'm sorry to interrupt, Cody.
No, that's it. I've seen some other comments. Glass jars. The canvas is really large.
Yeah.
The type of brush, is it a calligraphy brush? And that there's other paints in progress, maybe.
Cool. Okay. I love this because embedded in this last observation, maybe other paintings in progress, is a think, right? So let's move ahead one slide into our next step. So we started with observations where if I had been really obnoxious, I would have said, well, what do you see that makes you say that, da, 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 da. But instead we're just moving along because I want to prioritize getting us to our amazing expert, Gwen. So you all have just dropped into the chat box. This is where you can start to use your chat box as a documentation tool. If you skim back through all the stuff that people wrote in the chat box, my invitation to you now is to answer the questions that you see on the screen. So type up real quick, what do you think about Alma Thomas's work or her process based on what you can see? So I'm asking you to be a detective a little bit. And then what connections can you make to your prior knowledge or lived experience? In the same way that Gwen knew, for instance, that the frame would not have been on if this was like a super unfinished canvas. Bring those connections. So if you know something about Alma Thomas already, that's fair play. If you know something about fashion, that's fair play. If you know something about technology and you're noticing that for instance, the paint pots are of a certain type, fair play. So bring all of that and drop it into the chat box. So something, I mean, I don't know much about fashion, but I do associate this kind of shift dress with like the 60s, early 70s. I'm imagining that like if this image was in color, I think it would probably be a riot of colors just because it's so many different patterns. So those are the things that I'm thinking. So that makes me think about the Alma Thomas's artwork as being really colorful. And that's my connection. Is there anything that you like that's sparking for you, Gwen, when you start to think about what you think about her process or her artwork or connections you're making?
I don't know if it's fair to ask me yet.
Okay, fair. Okay. Cody,
Maybe
anything that you're noticing?
Yeah, we'll jump in from the chat and then Gwen can
Yeah.
Give her opinion here. Some people wondering, is she painting from memory, or is like where is this kind of coming from? Some observations that she's an abstract painter and that she's in her studio. How casual her process is, because her paper isn't even flat, she's just kind of going at it. Lots of observation about the period.
Cool.
Is she actually painting from Darren? She's touching the painting, but the paintbrush looks clean, which is, is she just dry brushing or what?
Yeah.
And that she's created a Zoom happy, amazing background. I'm gonna duplicate it.
Love it. That's awesome. Thank you.
Actually, that brings up a really interesting point. Notice the arcing lines of the work that she's actively working on in relationship to the plant next to her.
Oh, Gwen.
Now, I'm not saying that she's painting that plant, but one thing that we know about Alma Thomas, and if you look at the titles of her artworks, she was very inspired by her garden. Gardening was very important to her, and it's a concept that, and fashion is a concept that's actually explored in a current exhibition at the Chrysler Museum of Art, and will be coming to DC. Alma Thomas, Everything is Beautiful, at the Phillips Collection this winter.
Thank you. I can't tell you how many times we've looked at this photograph and I've never noticed that. And so there, I will offer myself as an exemplar of why, when we have these open-ended discussions about objects, there's just like all these things that start to spark. And so making sense of things together can be really powerful. Okay, so here's the download. So if we were in a highly interactive environment where I could see your faces or, all these things, I would do this differently. For the purposes of today, in order to make it interactive, I'll just warn you, I'm about to do a download. And the way that you can engage with what I'm about to download to you is by dropping into the chat box words or phrases that you think are really important to hold on to, because I'm about to tell you about Alma Thomas's life. I want to make sure we're all, standing on the same ground. But make sure you're grabbing those things so that when we kind of look back at the chat box that you are generating together, there is this documentation that's really rich and captures not only your sees and your thinks, but then also some historical context. So get ready for the download. Gwen, will you page ahead one, please? Okay, so this is Union Station, Washington, D.C., circa 1907. And I'm starting here because in the early 1900s, Alma Thomas's family left Columbus, Georgia, where they had a really rich social and economic connection. They were a middle-class family. Alma Thomas remembered very fondly the house that she grew up in, being surrounded all around by flowers. But her family was really prioritizing education. And so she was brought up to DC and became part of many, many different scenes in DC. But what I'm really impressed by is her overall lifetime dedication to education. So when she's in DC, she goes to high school, she excels at math and architectural drawing, which I think is fascinating. She goes on to attend a teacher's normal school, and she starts to specialize in early childhood education. Then she moved slightly north of DC to Wilmington, Delaware. She moved to a settlement school, or settlement house rather, that was established for the education of Black adults and children. And she taught kindergarten for 6 years. The woman who had established that settlement house was a Howard University grad. So there are some connections there, because Thomas ends up coming back to DC to attend Howard University. She intends to study costume design, but while she is in the midst of all her classes, she gets recruited into painting. And in 1924, Alma Thomas becomes the first person to graduate from Howard University with a degree in fine arts. So she's like a trailblazer, right? So she goes on, she's not done with education. Are you ready for this? Will you page ahead one? This is a photo from the later era of Thomas's teaching career. She teaches middle school. During the summers of 1930 to 34, she goes to Columbia in order to complete her teacher training. So she's teaching during the school year, going to school during the summer. And then when she's done, she could rest on her laurels, right? She's got her teaching degree. She's got her established teaching job. She's working at Shaw. Instead, she's like, not content to sit still. She starts a student art club. It met on Saturdays to explore art all around the city. So she brought her students to various museums. And one of her really admiring colleagues said, through a series of lectures, slides, and pictures, the child is taught the history of art with emphasis on the history of American art and the art of the American Negro. So Alma Thomas is deliberately creating a very affirming program for her students. She's a teacher for 35 years. And again, not content to sit still. She is teaching during the school year, and she's also taking painting classes at American University. And she is also helping to shape the DC arts landscape. So she helps to co-found at this time an art gallery where people of varied nationalities and races and ethnicities all have their works displayed together on the same walls. So finally, 1960, a year that might spark some connections in your head if you're a history person. 1960, she retires, finally. And then she gets her MFA. So she's like a very busy woman, right? 3 years later, after her retirement, and she'll page ahead one, Gwen, marches in the March on Washington. And so she, alongside 250,000 other people, link arms, and they march through DC. And particularly for Alma Thomas, she was attending an Episcopal church. She met up with another Episcopal church, and they marched together down 16th Street toward the Washington Monument. I don't know why it's not coming up. It doesn't really matter. On the left side, there's a painting. Oh, there it is. Hurrah. Thank you, Gwen and technology. So, we can say that she did all of these things, but she was also painting about them. So the image that you see on the left is not ours. It's from the Columbus Museum. But Alma Thomas's sister, Jacqueline, says, this March for Humanity inspired one of Alma's paintings titled A March on Washington. So yes, we do know that Alma Thomas was inspired by so many things around her. As Gwen shared at the top, Alma Thomas was really inspired by plants. And if you'll page ahead one, Thomas lived in this row home in Washington, D.C. for her whole life that she lived in D.C. And there used to be this beautiful holly bush out in front of it. It is no longer there. But she found inspiration in that holly bush and so many different things, as you can see from the pull quote on the slide. She was really interested in ways that she could be inspired by things close to home. But she also found inspiration further afield. And on this next slide, you'll see why we were kind of giggling to each other when we saw those promo videos. So Alma Thomas is born into a horse-drawn world, right? Like this is, and then she's like migrating north, and then she's, doing all the things. And by the end of her life, we've got a man on the moon. We've got this woman who takes her first plane flight in her much later life. And she says, oh my gosh, I see the world in a brand new way. So she is experiencing the world in so many different huge shifts. And the way that she started to incorporate those shifts is not in her artistic self, is not only in the content of her paintings, but as Gwen will tell us in a minute, she's also kind of helping to think through some of the technology kind of in her approach. And so we're going to hear all about that in a minute. Cody, are there any words that are coming up a lot in the chat as people were trying to grab words and phrases?
I think there's been a lot of just like, wow, I'm so excited to see this, or I didn't know she did this, or, oh, you know, she marched with this Episcopalian church and I'm familiar with it. And so
cool.
Lots of just like head nodding in the crowd and people saying, oh, wow, wow, wow.
Cool. Okay, excellent. So then Gwen, we've got this question. So this is going to be a seed for Gwen, right? So I'm inviting you all out in the world who are so wowed by all of this. What are you wondering? Like, what questions do you want to capture for your history colleagues, for your science colleagues, for your math colleagues, for your ELA colleagues? What wonders do you want to capture in the chat box? And then we'll direct some of those science-y ones toward Gwen kind of over the course of the next few minutes. My seed wonder for you, Gwen, is how is this approach that we just took, this like see, then think, then wonder, like how does that have anything to do with your own practice?
Loaded. So I'll admit, when I first saw Alma Thomas's paintings, they seemed a little straightforward. I should to put it lightly, but thinking more about, you know, reading more and researching more, and to knowing about math a little bit. Randomness is very hard. To do something that is completely random, those marks on the canvas, any mathematician will tell you that it's hard to do, because when you start to do something, you will develop a pattern. And it is breaking up pattern making that draws the human eye to something. I can't remember the name, but if you see like a broken line and there's a couple dashes missing, your eye will actually fill that in.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things that I'm wondering, and I'm wondering, like, when was that concept introduced, and was she familiar to it?
Gorgeous. So you, as a conservator who's become so intimately familiar with her work, you're actually still uncovering wonders. And I'm thinking about, like, for the science people in the room, this is one of the many scientific habits of mine, to remain in curiosity, to slow down your thinking before you create a hypothesis. You make an observation first, and that sort of thing. So this, you know, these connections, I hope are not only deliberate on our part, but also perhaps useful for exercising those thoughts for students. Okay, so I see some questions popping up in the chat box. We're going to get to those in a minute. I promise. But I want to learn a little bit more from you, Gwen, about the steaminess of Alma Thomas.
The steaminess, yes. Well, just touch on this really briefly. I've sort of already introduced myself and what I do, but one of the things that I want to point out is, you know, conservators, in addition to caring for the collection, is, you know, part of that is anticipating how an artwork will change over time. Is what we're seeing currently what was originally intended when the artwork was made? And if something has happened to the artwork, say, you know, somebody poked it, or there's a hole, or it got damaged, how can we treat it? And the materials that we bring to that artwork, can we ensure that they're not going to interact negatively with the original materials? And because entropy, okay, science, is a thing, we know materials are going to change. Our materials are going to change differently from the original. And can we remove ours in order to, if we need to, retreat that artwork? And it's not just for us, you know, we are treating this artwork for generations. This is the nation's collection, and it is not ours, it is the public's. And we want to make sure that the public can see it now and in the future. So turning to Alma Thomas, here we have a familiar picture here. Again, as Elizabeth said, you know, she was very inspired by what was happening around her. Oops. Run back. This is blast off. It's actually in the collection of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, and currently on display at that exhibition. She was so inspired by the program, she actually made 14 paintings in her late 60s and early 70s, and the 60s and 70s, that are inspired by NASA's space program. And we're going to be seeing a number of those today. And I really started to love Alma Thomas because there's part of me that always wanted to be an astronaut. Obviously I'm not, I have a different job today, but connecting Alma Thomas's paintings to these specific moments in space exploration was really exciting. I do want to note that NASA actually did pay for some original artwork to be made by artists. Alma Thomas was not one of them, but somebody that they did introduce was Charles Schulz. And so this is probably my favorite painting by Alma Thomas. This is Snoopy Early Sun Display. It's in our collection. And the name is actually after the beloved Peanuts character, Snoopy. So after a really terrible fire that killed all 3 astronauts of the Apollo 1 mission, NASA instituted a very rigorous safety program. And they wanted to award their employees and contractors with an award. Sorry, I'm going to turn off the chat to their staff members who exceeded these expectations, and they were awarded the Silver Snoopy Award. And you can see that here on the screen. And these pins actually go into space and come back before they're awarded. And you can see Charles Schulz's original concept art. And so he agreed, yes, use my artwork for these posters, but you can't use old art. I want to make new art for this program, for these posters. And so this is that original drawing for the pin, and you can actually see the underdrawing where he's working out where the arms are going to be and the hands, and how are we going to depict that oxygen tank, where would it be connected for Snoopy. And Snoopy eventually, he became this great mascot for the Apollo 10 mission, so much in fact that the astronauts actually petted that big stuffed Snoopy that you see in the upper left. And the command space module was named Charlie Brown, and the lunar module was named Snoopy. And NASA scientists actually named it that because the lunar module was going to snoop the surface of the moon to look for the ideal site for the Apollo 11 lunar module to land. You remember that quote? The eagle has landed, Snoopy got him there. I think Woodstock might be a little jealous. So these photographs were actually taken by the scientists in the Apollo 10 mission. And they were brought back on the spacecraft when they came back to Earth, and they're developed and dispersed at that point. And so Alma Thomas would have seen these original photographs or prints of these original photographs. So we start to get to a major point in what conservation can do today is explore artwork with photography. And so what are the types of photographs that were being taken at this time? We were not doing digital film, where there was daguerreotypes and all these older processes, but these are probably silver gelatin prints. And this is really important for what we're doing today. The electromagnetic spectrum is probably one of my favorite things because I am a guaranteed nerd. Humans can only see a very small portion of the EM spectrum. There's other animals that can see into the UV, such as butterflies and bees, because what they're looking for are plants, and things that fluoresce in the UV are likely going to be pollinators. And so that's something that they're going to continue to go back to. And this research, a lot of this research was done in collaboration with Vivi Nicklaus, and she was brought in to help compile a lot of these images and the archival research that went into the chapter that we helped write for the Everything is Beautiful catalog. And so I thank her for her dedicated work with me in interpreting these results that we're sharing with you today. But some of the things that she wasn't as familiar with were the connections directly to NASA. And I think that was just because of time, sorry, but skipping on to the visible light photograph. We document everything as it comes in because we want to track the physical condition of the artwork as it is accepted. And if anything happens to it, in 10 to 20 years, are we seeing any fading of those pigments? Is there a reason for that fading of pigments, and can we ameliorate or prevent against that? And in addition to the visible, we will take a series of other photographs. This is actually in UV. And so UV is very high energy, and UVC in particular is very dangerous. So that's actually why it's sterilizing equipment, especially today. But what we want to do is use UV energy closer to the visible wavelengths, because what that will do is it will give us surface information, surface coatings or resins that are characteristic of specific materials, as well as some of the pigments and binders that would have been used by the artist. And so you see that bright pinky orange fluorescence. And that's from some rose madder, which is a plant-based pigment that she's actually using to glaze those areas. And it's one of the few materials that will actually fluoresce in that range or that color. And so we can pretty much identify that material just with UV images. But some of the more fascinating photographs for Alma Thomas come when we look at infrared. And infrared radiation will actually penetrate through materials. We experience infrared every day when we walk outside, especially when we're wearing black and we start to feel the heat from the sun. When it comes to a painting, infrared absorptive materials such as carbon black pencils and pigments will actually absorb that energy, and the underlying support will actually reflect that infrared light back. And you can't just pull out a normal camera to do this image. We actually have a camera, and I skipped over it when I was introducing Sydney. So here is a regular DSL camera. It has a sensor that is actually sensitive from the UV to into the near infrared range. But what the manufacturer has done is actually put films in front of that sensor so it only sees in the visible. I sent this camera out to have those filters removed, and now I put filters in front of the lens to actually capture the images in the ideal range. And this is my infrared. And so you'll notice that you cannot see through it. And it's designed to be that way. We're not supposed to see visible light through it. Only infrared irradiation will actually get through that filter. Put this down so I don't drop it. So, okay, as I mentioned, we're literally seeing through her paintings. And so I have some details for you here. This is a detail of Snoopy early sun display in your visible light. And this is a great one in the infrared. So some things that you might see here, actually, Elizabeth, what do you see in this photograph? I put it in red for you.
Even before the red, I was noticing like the lines. So it's making me think back to what you were saying about the challenge of not falling into patterns when you're trying to create randomness. And I'm thinking about like how hard it must have been for her to create something that sort of looked random, but also had this very specific underlying structure. That's fascinating.
Yes. So by just setting up herself with a couple things, she's able to create, and you look for a pattern too when you're looking at things. And so creating artwork that had a pattern sort of ensured that people were looking at her art, but then trying to see, where is the eye drawn to? And so in this little mock-up, you can actually see where I've sort of reinterpreted. You've got these little hash marks first, and then the straight lines that were drawn. And I don't know if you can see my cursor there underneath okay. So those are the little hash marks that were made for where the long straight lines were going to be. And along the right-hand side where the curve is, something that is exciting for us when we're looking at that, you see how rough and sketchy that is? That tells me that she's doing it by hand. It is not with a very large, protractor is not the word. I forgot the word. Yes, it's not a compass. And there's not a hole in the middle of that circle that would be used for like a pen and a string and a pencil to actually draw that. That's all done by hand. So those are some of the things that we're noticing in that infrared detail. But within that little red, what do you see there, Elizabeth?
I'm gonna get up close. Sorry, everybody, for smashing my face. Oh, I don't know. What is it? I can't tell.
It's Y.
It's what?
It's a Y. So if I scroll back quickly, it does not line up with the yellow. It's right next to it. So this is not the only painting where she actually put little inscriptions to tell herself where the colors were going to go. And it's not the one where she got off track and decided to put other colors in it too. So we see.
You've just gone mute. Can you?
That was my own. That was my own finger. So we see not only is she's planning these paintings out, but she's not afraid to modify them during the painting process. And if you look at the archival photograph, you can zoom in, you see those drawn lines plotted out on this canvas that she's actually working on. So let's see here. So, oh, this is actually a lot of fun. This painting, or sorry, the work that she's doing in the photograph is actually related to another NASA image. And so the first image of Mars, Mariner 4 satellite, launched in 1964, got its closest approach to Mars in, it was July 15th, 1965. And so that satellite never came back to Earth. How did they get the image? How do you think?
Is it radio or TV or something?
Radio, you got it exactly.
But you can't see radio waves.
No, but you can pick those up. A numeric code was actually transmitted back to Earth. That code had a key, and here you see the scientists interpreting that code into color and creating this image even before computers could process that photograph. And now think back to the late 90s and the early 2000s. If you are as old as I am, you remember modem speeds and how long it took for a low resolution image to come over.
And that horrible, horrible noise.
Yes. Oh, just mind blown. I would love to see this image someday. It was actually like framed and given to the director of the JPL in California. But, and I can't talk too much about this image and what I think it actually might have to do with another Alma Thomas right now, just for the matter of time's sake. But again, we see Alma Thomas reacting to photographs that are being made by the space program around her. And that pale blue dot, the blue marble that we are in space. I can't help but believe that this image is inspired by that thing. So, and this leads me to wonder, how would Alma Thomas be inspired by the telescopes that are present day? The Hubble Telescope, for instance. This was launched in 1990 and has been upgraded a number of times since its launch. Unfortunately, Alma Thomas passed away. I mean, in 1978, again, as Elizabeth mentioned, she's born into a horse-drawn world, and yet she sees the image that came back from Mars. And so we've got some that EM spectrum up on top and some of the specific satellites and where they're operating in from. Hubble Telescope will actually, it takes images in all three, the visible, the UV, and the infrared. And so what we're seeing in the middle, that colorized image, that's not visible light. That's actually a false color infrared image. And they've actually identified the elements that are in the celestial bodies and colorize them to coordinate with those elements. Blue being oxygen, red, sulfur, for instance. And with their upgraded infrared camera, we can see even more stars that are beyond those original those photographed areas. I shouldn't say that they're processing that original photograph, they're re-imaging those same coordinates with their upgraded infrared cameras. So guess what we can do? We can also identify elements at the Lunar Conservation Center. So this is actually a composite detail of some of the red pats that are in Snoopy early sun display. And I say composite image, so the XRF spectrometer, X-ray fluorescence spectrometer, will shoot a tiny little X-ray beam from a tube and at the specific area, and that actually knocks off a little electron, and that creates a characteristic secondary X-ray beam, which then shoots back into the detector. And that energy difference is characteristic of that type of elements that is there. And so here in this specific pinky area, we have a map of cadmium and chromium based paints there. And so what do you see that's missing from this though, Elizabeth? So that's just the red area.
Oh, the white isn't there, and that yellowy ochre sort of thing on the left side.
Exactly. So that tells me that these are not areas that are containing either cadmium or chromium. We do know that the ground, however, actually contain a small amount of lead and barium, which were two pigments that were available at the time. But as I mentioned, randomness, planning, is she just sort of painting by memory, or is this very ad hoc? we know from the infrared images and the archival research that she's very careful about, I shouldn't say careful, that she's thinking very critically about color relationships and how these paths are meant to be. She's doing numerous amounts of sketches on paper, many that she would actually staple together, and some that she literally pinned or taped onto a canvas, and then reinterpreted these in paint on the canvas. And again, just a flashback really quickly to look at the infrared in Snoopy early sun display. So as Elizabeth mentioned, look at the size of, the size of her brush in her photograph. And she is 70 years old at this point. My grandmother was a quilter who had terrible arthritis, and she wasn't able to quilt at the end of her life because it hurt too much to hold the needle. And the amount of pressure and strength it takes to hold a pencil in your hand, it becomes worse, especially when you have very debilitating arthritis. So as somebody who is continuing to push herself later on in life, she is actually modifying her technique to make her paintings. And so here is a detail of a slightly later painting. This is Skylight in the Smithsonian's Hirshhorn Museum of Art, where she's no longer, she's putting the hash marks, but she's no longer drawing the entire straight line. What she has done here is actually, and she's written about it, using sewing elastics and rulers to guide her lines. And so I've actually created, and you can see in the infrared detail and the red oval at right, those little hash marks, a little piece of sewing elastic around this tiny little mock-up. And you see those firm little edges that were applied, and it actually gets on the elastic to guide herself throughout. And again, randomness is actually quite difficult to force yourself into, because if you're doing one thing, you do develop that pattern. So she actually makes corrections, and we've seen them on her canvas, and actually did a couple corrections here too, little bit of white paint on top to break up that blue strip there.
Gwen, I could listen to you for a million billion more years.
We got to wrap this up.
Yes, I just want to make sure we save like 5 minutes for people to like synthesize their thinking and get the resources that we want to give them. So do you have like 1 more minute of beautiful content?
This right here, one of her last painting, Red Azaleas Singing, Dancing, Rock and Roll. And this is why it's super important to see a painting in person. This painting, 6 feet tall, 13 feet wide. She worked in her kitchen in her tiny little row home, flat on a table. She was never able to actually see this work compiled together and installed until it was in a gallery. And her friend Jacob Kanan said that in the end of her life, she was so weak that she had to actually prop herself up between 2 tables to paint.
Wow, she was such a dedicated woman.
Yes.
I'm so glad that you gave us that image of her, because it's so easy to think of her like these pictures of her as like a sweet old lady and all of this, but she's
pushing it.
Yeah.
And again, talking about compensating for illness, the difference in size between pencil and paintbrush, but then as well, and this is what I forgot to mention really quickly, there's no longer just the pats. She's moving to these larger glyph-like and comma shapes, and it was probably easier to paint those than the one, the rigid running along the lines. So
I love this. Okay, so now I'm super excited to see the show. Those are her hands, and I just think this is, when we start to think about what can art do, art can help us figure out how to problem solve in reverse. It can help us think through our feelings or think through our thoughts, all these things, but also it gives us a chance to humanize people who are no longer with us, and to be able to see the end of her work and then also put her hands with them. It's just like really emphasizes the dedication, which is awesome. Okay, so will you page ahead 1, please? With our last 5 minutes, I promise, friends, we will end you on time. I want to give you a full minute to just think, because we just gave you so much information, either in the chat box, on your phone, next to your computer, on a piece of paper, however works for you. A full minute of our silence so that you can make notes about these connections. And I'm going to put on a timer so that I don't forget.
While we're waiting for responses to come in to give them back, I just wanted to share how thankful everyone is to both of you of all the information that you shared. And, I speak for myself too. I learned so much, and there's so many more facets to her work that I understand now. And I think everyone really appreciated it.
Thank you, Cody. All right, so that was 1 minute of silence. The intention there again is just to realize that when you've got that much information, even 1 minute is not enough, but we wanted to help be able to gel some stuff in your mind. If you're feeling generous, you might pop your thoughts into the chat box so that we can learn from one another. That way your colleagues who are in this session right now will be able to be inspired by your connections. The last thing I want to do is to just share with you where you can find out more. So Gwen, if you'll page ahead one. So we again are at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. If you wanted to use our collection and dig around in it, there are two ways to do that. One is on the left side. You can go to our website, americanart.si.edu, and go into the collection search. You can search by keyword and all kinds of stuff. There's even a thing where you can search by color, which I think is fascinating. Or alternatively, you can go to the Smithsonian Learning Lab, and there's a treasure trove there. I'm sure it's been plugged in a lot of other sessions, but we did create a Learning Lab collection with some of Alma Thomas's work for you to complement this session. So you can see it's a tiny URL ending in /Sam Alma Thomas. Gwen has generously put her email address on the screen here, so feel free to grab a screenshot or alternatively snap a picture with your phone. And then I'll put in a plug also for our further resources. So we have some STEM resources, we have history resources, we have literacy resources. We've got a lot of different stuff. We're venturing into SEL territory. So if you're noticing that your students need a boost or a way to work through the challenging emotions of this past year and a half, or even before that, there are some resources available on the website. And Gwen, if you'll page ahead one. I also want to provide you with my email address. So it's dinese@si.edu. And I do professional development and student programs. We have online teacher workshops throughout the school year on Wednesdays. And those are usually like 4:30 to 5:30 or so Eastern time. So I am grateful. I am also grateful for the amazing ideas that are coming through in the chat. I'm seeing ideas about the presentation of historical and contemporary events. Science and space is getting a lot of love. The ability of color to affect and capture our emotions. There's so much richness in what you shared with us, Gwen, and I'm so very grateful to work with you. And so grateful to all of the teachers who were here with us today. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much for spending your time with us.
Yeah, wonderful. All right,